But it's important to underline it, because women do play a major part in growth through developing the agricultural sector notably. And so Africa is now following in the path of what Asia did, training a number of specialists and executive workers in Western countries notably. And I think that in about 10 or 20 years, we'll have the human capital for people actually being able to effect that change. So we have the vision and we'll have the people power into the future. I think change will also arise from the fact that natural resources, raw materials, are in Africa. This is we were saying that Africa withholds 25% of the world's natural resource base. So if you have the people and if you have the natural resources, you can really boost and accelerate growth. When Alain Perfit was talking about China and the huge change that was underway in China, but I think Africa will be even more of a surprising success story. That transformation can occur very quickly. And of course, it's businessmen before policy leaders that see that change on the horizon, because they anticipate these new boundaries that are extended for development. To bounce back on what was just what we've just heard, and I would ask this question of Kaberuka: how can these other models from China and East Asia and Asian economies, how can they continue to inspire development in Africa? And I'm talking about Latin America as well.
The way
we can switch from French to English anytime.
Thank you so much. Why not Spanish? First of all, I'm happy to be back here because I think this forum is extremely useful. And thank you, Angel, for getting together again and for our cooperation. Let me respond to your question specifically. What can we learn from Asia? My answer is straightforward. There are many things we can learn from Asia. But there's no economic model in the world which is transposable. There is a myth that you can transpose an Asian model to Africa. That is not possible. What I've been saying is that every country has to find its own path to economic development. In fact, the joke we have in the bank is that there is no escalator, there's no lift to development. You have to go up the stairs. It is tough. You fall, you stand, you keep moving. The idea that you can find a smooth way, a quicker way by copying someone else is simply not there. Asians made many mistakes, by the way. I don't know if I can say this here, Angel, but you recall, in the late 50s, China went through a very difficult period. Millions died of hunger. Up to today, a number of countries in the Asian region are struggling with many of the problems we are struggling with here. But there's one thing, though, which is relevant, is that the role of institutions in actually anchoring and driving development is critical. Because as we adopted the Washington Consensus here in the 1980s, dismantling the state, something then happened. We dismantled the state, replaced it with nothing, somewhere in the naive belief that the market will deliver development. Now we know that development comes in many forms. Some have succeeded through laissez-faire capitalism. Others have succeeded through state-led capitalism. Others through what I call welfare capitalism. Others even by muddling through. But I'm convinced, I think as our little brother Mele Zenawi used to say, that at the end of the day, in a country like ours, in a continent like ours, we need to have strong institutions, the state being one of them, to try to drive, to influence change and development. That is the only thing I can get from Asia. The second one would probably be how to invest early to reap the demographic dividend. This is what the Asians did in the 1970s. This is what Latin Americans missed. They missed the demographic dividend, and they're still paying a price. So, with these demographics in Africa, which are in our favor, more people, younger people, urbanized, the time to invest in the human capital demographic dividend is now. And the best way to do it is precisely using some of these natural resources to translate what Professor Porter called inherited wealth into created wealth, which wealth is the people. If we can link those two, after all, oil, you inherit it, you find in the ground. You have now to turn oil and gas into your wealth, which is the people. Because having natural resources is no guarantee of success. And not having natural resources is not condemnation to failure. It is the link between the natural resources, inherited wealth, into created wealth, which is the people that makes a difference.
Okay, but let's be very concrete now. Because we see many questions on Twitter, and this is all the questions we're hearing all the time on the ground. People see huge investments coming in African countries who are in the energy sector, huge infrastructure. We're talking about billions of dollars. And at the end of the day, they don't see how this is transformed for them to create a real job. So what should we do? What could be done to really show that the transformation of the natural resources will have a very, I would say, immediate impact on jobs? Or we should say, no, you have to wait 2, 3, 4 years. We need to be absolutely transparent with the people who are today jobless. Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Well, I think you're right to allude to the effect of investment on employment and changes in living conditions. Let me give you an example of what we've been doing in Côte d'Ivoire. Development in Côte d'Ivoire has been based on agriculture. Our first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, although at the time people were aware of the existence of oil and gas, had decided not to engage in exploiting these resources in the 1960s. It was only subsequently that this was done, because at the time the emphasis was on developing agriculture, both for exports and for subsistence. As you know, we produce 1.4, 1.5 million tons or so of cocoa, and are, as such, the leading cocoa producer in the world. There was a plan for some $4 billion, 60% of which was financed by the private sector. And this had to do with boosting yields in export-oriented agricultural sectors, but above all, with developing the subsistence agriculture sector. We're talking about 2.4 million jobs. I went to 2 regions, Yamoussoukro, which you're familiar with, was one of them, and there is an international firm there. I would not like to advertise its name, but they're investing not just in coffee and cocoa, but also in rice, with 15,000 direct job creations and another 40,000 secondary employment opportunities. So I went to a Belgian company which is creating some 12,000 direct jobs, half of which are for women. There are 16 such international companies and corporations working in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, in organic banana production in the north of the country. All of this to say that it is possible to generate considerable employment through these initiatives. If we leave subsistence agriculture aside and look at cashew nut production, in the 1990s we only produced barely 5 tons, or perhaps 5,000 tons of cashews. And the decision was taken subsequently to give cashews equal priority with cotton production. We're henceforth at between 450 and 500,000 tons per annum. And this leads to only about 10% being processed locally. But it is a sector which calls for considerable manpower, particularly women. And the fact is that we may have considerable natural resources, but we need to focus on opportunities to create jobs, particularly for young people and women. I wanted to, to talk in practical terms about the issue you raised. Thank you very much. Carlos Lopez, we've had a stream of questions from Twitter, and as someone who has a very global view on the whole of the continent, some people say that it's utopian to envisage a common market in a continent with so many different countries. Others feel that there are conflicts of interest between the different countries. How do you see all of these efforts and hopes of creating a common market and working together towards development?
On Asia, your question to President Kaberuka, to land on your very pertinent question. There are things I would like to copy from Asia. Like, for instance, the fact that the Naxalite and the Kashmir conflict in India affects about 200 million people, which is twice the number of people affected by conflict in Africa. I wouldn't like to copy the Strait of Malacca piracy because it's 5 times what we have witnessed in the Somali coast. I wouldn't like to have elections like they do in Vietnam. I would like to have problems of human rights like we have in Myanmar. And I can go on with the list. My point is the following. Asia is very good with marketing. Africa is not yet at that point. We do have problems, but the way the problems are portrayed do not do justice to the efforts that are made. And I'm going to just use your very good introduction of the good news. And then you end up with the MDGs. Now, look at the MDGs, which is a very good indicator of how Africa really is shortchanged in the way it is marketed. You cannot have the reduction of poverty by half in Paraguay at the same level of comparator as reduction the poverty in Niger, because one is going to reduce about 20-something% and the other is going to reduce about 80% of the population. Historically speaking, this doesn't make any sense. These comparisons of who meets and who doesn't meet the MDGs with a universal target as this is basically the same for Sweden or for Mali don't make any sense. Now, if you actually measure the level of effort that each country has given, you will see that Africa, because of its low end, has 15 of the 20 best performers on MDG achievements. But that is not the story that is passed on. And going back to Asia, I would say that one of the characteristics that has really worked in China, the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping can be almost reduced to that particular insight, is the fact that they realize even though they have an integrated, very centralized political system, they could make it just as a whole. They needed to have locomotives. They needed to have special economic zones. They needed to understand why is it that Chinese do so well in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and cannot do it in continental China. And obviously, the reason is that the context needed to change. They needed special measures. They needed special characteristics. And there you go with the special economic zones that end up creating the locomotives that are the pull factor for transformation in China. In Africa, when you deal with regional integration, people refuse to discuss locomotives. It's sort of a political taboo to try to understand that for Africa to make it, there is a need for integrated markets, but integrated markets require pull factors like the locomotives. So that's one issue that we really have to put at the table. The second issue that we have to put at the table is to stop talking about regional integration as if it was a trade agenda. It has been hijacked by trade. And the reason why being hijacked by trade is so